I'm Marcus Thompson, 38, a retired Marine Corps logistics officer turned small business consultant. For 3 years, my family dismissed my methodical approach as too rigid and outdated military thinking. At every family gathering, my younger brother David would roll his eyes when I suggested systematic solutions to their struggling tech startup. My sister Amanda would laugh and say, "This isn't the Marines, Marcus. The business world has evolved." But last Tuesday, when their company faced a catastrophic supply chain failure that threatened to bankrupt them within 48 hours, everything changed. While they panicked and blamed each other, I quietly assessed the situation using the same tactical planning that had saved lives overseas. In exactly 18 hours, I had not only solved their crisis, but uncovered the real reason. Their business was failing, and it had nothing to do with outdated thinking. What happened next would force my family to confront some uncomfortable truths about respect, competence, and the value of experience they'd spent years dismissing. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday that would change everything. I was reviewing client proposals over coffee when my phone buzzed with David's contact photos. The same dismissive smirk he'd worn last Christmas when I'd suggested implementing quality control protocols for his company. "Marcus, we need help." His voice cracked with desperation I'd never heard before. "Everything's falling apart." The text chain that followed painted a catastrophic picture. Screenshots of angry client emails, legal threats, and financial projections. That made my stomach drop. Their biggest client, representing 60% of annual revenue, had received a shipment of completely defective products. Not just defective, unusable. 20,000 units of custom software interfaces that wouldn't even power on. The clients threatening to sue for breach of contract. David continued, his usual confidence replaced by panic. "We've got 4 hours to fix this, or they're pulling out entirely. Marcus, if we lose them, we're done. Bankruptcy. Everything Mum and Dad left us, gone." I set down my coffee, my mind automatically shifting into crisis assessment mode. What does Amanda say? She's freaking out, blaming me, blaming our suppliers, blaming everyone except herself for not catching this earlier. His bitter laugh held no humor. "She keeps saying we need to think outside the box, be creative, find some innovative solution. But Marcus, I don't know what to do." The irony wasn't lost on me. For 3 years, they'd dismissed my systematic approach as inflexible thinking. Now, facing their first real crisis, creativity and innovation had failed them. They needed exactly what they'd always mocked: methodical problem-solving and crisis management. "Send me everything," I said, already reaching for my tactical planning notebook. Financial statements, supplier contracts, production schedules, the client agreement, everything. "You'll help us." The relief in his voice was palpable. "I'm family," I replied simply. "But David, when I get there, no eye-rolling, no jokes about military rigidity. This is life or death for your company." "Understood," he said quietly. "Marcus, thank you." After hanging up, I stared at the frantic text chain on my screen. Each message revealed deeper layers of chaos and mismanagement, but I'd seen worse. In Kandahar, I'd coordinated supply drops under enemy fire. In business consulting, I'd saved 3 companies from bankruptcy using the same principles. The difference was that this time, it was personal. Walking into Thompson Digital Solutions felt like entering a war zone. The usually pristine reception area was cluttered with boxes, papers scattered across every surface, and the receptionist looked like she hadn't slept in days. The familiar hum of productive work had been replaced by frantic whispers and the sharp tone of crisis calls. David met me at the elevator, his typically perfect hair disheveled, His shirt wrinkled. "Thank God you're here," he said, leading me through the maze of panicked employees. "It's worse than I thought." Amanda stood in the conference room, gesticulating wildly at a whiteboard covered in chaotic brainstorming notes. Her usually composed demeanor had cracked, revealing the stress beneath. "We need to pivot," she was saying to a group of shell-shocked managers. "Rebrand this as a learning opportunity. Show the client our agility." "Amanda," I interrupted gently. She turned, and I saw the exhaustion in her eyes. "Marcus," her voice carried a mixture of relief and embarrassment. "I suppose David told you about our little situation." Little situation. Even in crisis, she was minimizing the reality. I pulled out my notebook and set it on the conference table. "Show me the financial statements first." What I saw made my jaw tighten. This wasn't just about one failed shipment. The company had been hemorrhaging money for months. Overstaffing, inflated vendor costs, delayed payments from clients, and zero contingency planning. The failed shipment was merely the final domino in a long chain of mismanagement. "David," I said quietly, studying the numbers, "you've been running at a loss for 6 months." He shifted uncomfortably. "We thought it would turn around." "The market's been challenging. The market's been challenging for everyone." I flipped through more pages, my military training automatically categorizing problems by severity and urgency. "But you've been making decisions based on hope instead of data." Amanda crossed her arms defensively. "We can't all run our businesses like military operations, Marcus. Sometimes you have to take risks." "This isn't risk-taking," I interrupted, pointing to a line item that made my stomach turn. "This is chaos. You're paying Jake Morrison's consulting firm 40% above market rate for basic vendor management." "Why?" David and Amanda exchanged a look I couldn't interpret. "Jake's been invaluable," David said carefully. "He streamlined our entire supply chain, negotiated better deals. Better deals." I pulled out my phone and opened a supplier database I maintained for my consulting clients. "You're paying premium prices for standard components. Jake Morrison has been charging you consulting fees while simultaneously marking up every supplier contract." The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. In Afghanistan, I'd learned to read situations quickly, to identify the critical failure points that could cost lives. Here, the failure point was clear. They'd trusted the wrong person with their company's lifeline. But admitting that would mean acknowledging that their modern approach to business relationships, trusting friends over competence, had nearly destroyed everything their parents had built. The tension in the conference room could have been cut with a knife. Amanda stared at the financial statements spread across the table, her face cycling through denial, anger, and something that looked like shame. David sat, hunched in his chair, repeatedly running his hands through his hair. "Jake Morrison has been my friend since college," David said finally, his voice defensive. "He wouldn't what?" Amanda's voice rose sharply. "Wouldn't take advantage of your loyalty. David, look at these numbers. We've been bleeding money, and you've been too trusting to see it." "Don't lecture me about trust," David shot back. "You're the one who approved his consulting contract without even reading the fine print. You said we needed someone innovative to modernize our supply chain." I watched this familiar pattern unfold, the same dynamic I'd observed at every family gathering for years. When pressure mounted, they turned on each other instead of addressing the real problem. Amanda would blame David's poor judgment in hiring friends. David would deflect by attacking Amanda's hands-off management style. Neither would take responsibility for the systemic failures. "Stop," I said quietly, but with enough authority to cut through their argument. "This isn't helping." Amanda whirled on me. "Don't you dare sit there acting superior, Marcus. We didn't ask for your judgment. Actually, you did." I pulled out a folder from my briefcase, one I'd hoped never to need. "These are the performance reviews from the past 2 years. Every promotion David made went to personal friends or college connections, regardless of qualifications. Sarah Mitchell, your former operations manager, she had 15 years of experience and an MBA. You replaced her with Jake's roommate from freshman year. David's face flushed. Those people understood our vision. What vision? I spread the reviews across the table like evidence in a court case. Declining productivity, increasing costs, missed deadlines, and now this catastrophic quality failure. This is what happens when loyalty trumps competence. The old Marcus would have stopped there, content to prove his point, but years of counseling after my discharge had taught me that being right wasn't the same as being helpful. I softened my tone. Look, I understand the impulse. In combat, you want people you trust watching your back. But David, this isn't combat. In business, trust has to be earned through performance, not given because of shared history. Amanda sank into her chair, suddenly looking older than her 34 years. So what do we do? Fire Jake. Explain to our suppliers that we've been incompetent. Admit to our biggest client that we had no quality control systems in place. We fix it, I said simply. But first, you both need to understand something. This crisis isn't just about Jake Morrison or failed products. It's about a company culture that prioritizes relationships over results. That stops today. David looked up at me with something I rarely saw from him. Genuine respect mixed with fear. You really think we can save this? I opened my tactical notebook and began sketching a crisis management flowchart. In Kandahar, I once had 18 hours to coordinate a supply drop to a forward base under siege. The original suppliers were compromised, half our transport was destroyed, and command was breathing down my neck. Know what I didn't do? They both shook their heads. I didn't waste time assigning blame or wishing the situation was different. I assessed what I had, identified what I needed, and built a new plan using available resources. I looked up from my notes. Your company isn't dead yet, but saving it requires admitting that everything you thought you knew about running a business was wrong. I pulled out my field notebook, the same leather-bound journal that had accompanied me through 3 deployments, and opened to a fresh page. The familiar weight of it in my hands brought back the muscle memory of countless briefings, where lives depended on accurate assessment and swift action. What's that? Amanda asked, eyeing the worn notebook with curiosity. Standard military assessment protocol, I replied, drawing a grid across the top of the page. We're going to map this crisis systematically. Immediate threats, available resources, critical dependencies, and timeline constraints. David leaned forward, his earlier defensiveness replaced by genuine interest. You really use military tactics for business. Crisis management is crisis management, I said, writing immediate threats in the first column. Whether you're coordinating supplies for a forward operating base or saving a failing company, the principles are identical. Gather accurate intelligence, identify critical failure points, allocate resources efficiently, and execute with precision. I began populating the grid with information from their financial statements and supplier contracts. Under immediate threats, I wrote, client lawsuit, 48 hours, bankruptcy, 30 days, supplier credibility, 72 hours, employee morale critical. The first rule of tactical assessment, I explained, is to separate emotion from facts. Right now, you're both operating on panic and blame. That's natural, but it's not useful. I moved to the second column, available resources. This required asking questions they clearly hadn't considered. How much emergency cash do you have access to? What's your credit limit? Do you have any suppliers you haven't used recently who might help in a crisis? Amanda pulled out her phone and started making calls to their accountant and bank. David rummaged through filing cabinets, looking for old supplier contacts. For the first time since I'd arrived, They were working together instead of against each other. Critical dependencies, I continued, writing in the third column. Your entire business model relies on Jake Morrison's supplier network. That's a single point of failure, something we would never tolerate in military logistics. David winced. We thought consolidating through one contact would be more efficient. It is more efficient. I agreed, until that contact becomes compromised. Then it's catastrophic. I showed them the grid, now partially filled with data. Look at this pattern. Every supplier contract goes through Jake. Every quality control checkpoint reports to Jake's team. Every backup plan depends on Jake's relationships. The realization dawned on Amanda's face first. He's not just stealing from us. He's made himself indispensable. Exactly. I flipped to a new page and began sketching a supply chain diagram. In military terms, you've created a perfect choke point. Enemy forces would love to find something like this. One person whose removal would cripple an entire operation. As I worked, I felt the familiar clarity that came with systematic analysis. Each piece of information slotted into place, revealing patterns that had been invisible in the chaos of crisis. The failed shipment wasn't random bad luck, it was the predictable result of cutting corners on quality control. The inflated costs weren't market fluctuations. They were systematic overcharging by someone who knew they wouldn't be questioned. Timeline. Constraints, I wrote in the final column. 46 hours until client deadline. 72 hours until word spreads to other clients. 1 week until suppliers start demanding immediate payment. David stared at the completed assessment grid. It looks impossible when you lay it out like that. No, I said, feeling the first stirrings of the tactical confidence that had served me well in Afghanistan. It looks solvable. Difficult, but solvable. The difference is that now we're working with facts instead of fears. I turned to a fresh page and began outlining our 18-hour recovery plan. The vendor contract was buried in a file cabinet marked 2024 agreements. But finding it felt like uncovering a smoking gun. I spread the documents across the conference table, while Amanda and David watched with growing unease. Look at this, I said, pointing to a clause that made my blood run cold. Original supplier, quote, $47 per unit. Jake's negotiated price, $73 per unit. He's been telling you he secured a discount while actually inflating costs by 50%. David's face went pale. That can't be right. Jake said he got us the best deal in the industry. Jake's been lying to you for 18 months. I pulled out more contracts, each one revealing the same pattern. Here's the adhesive rate, $12 per gallon. You're paying $19. Circuit boards should be $8 each. You're paying $14. Every single supplier contract has been modified after Jake's negotiations. Amanda snatched one of the contracts from my hands, scanning it with growing horror. These modifications, they're not even subtle. How did we miss this? Because you trusted without verifying, I said, not unkindly. You gave Jake signing authority and never audited his work. In military procurement, we have a saying, trust, but verify. You just trusted. I pulled out my laptop and began cross-referencing their payments with market databases. The numbers were staggering. Over 18 months, Jake Morrison had essentially stolen over $340,000 from the company through inflated supplier costs alone. His consulting fees were just the tip of the iceberg. There's more, I said grimly, opening another folder. These quality control reports Jake's been filing. They're fabricated. Look at the timestamps. He submitted quality approval for last week's shipment 3 days before it was even manufactured. David slumped in his chair like someone had punched him in the stomach. Jake was my roommate freshman year. I was best man at his wedding. His kids call me Uncle David. And he's been systematically robbing your family's company. I replied, personal relationships don't immunize people against greed, David. If anything, They make the theft easier because they exploit your natural trust. Amanda was doing rapid calculations on her phone. Marcus, if these numbers are accurate, Jake's theft is why we've been operating at a loss. Without his inflated costs, we would have been profitable this entire time. Worse than that, I said, pulling up the client contract on my laptop. The defective shipment isn't a quality control failure, it's sabotage. Jake knew this client was getting suspicious about costs. A catastrophic failure gives him cover to blame market conditions and supplier issues while hiding his theft. The silence in the room was deafening. David stared at Jake's contract modifications with the look of someone discovering their best friend had been poisoning them slowly. Amanda's business degree hadn't prepared her for the reality that someone they'd welcomed into their family could systematically destroy their parents' legacy. We have to confront him, David said finally, his voice hollow. No, I replied firmly. First, we save the company. Then we deal with Jake Morrison. Right now, our priority is that client deadline. We can pursue justice after we prevent bankruptcy. But I was already planning both operations simultaneously, the way I'd learned to coordinate multiple objectives in combat. Save the company, expose the theft, and ensure that Jake Morrison faced consequences for betraying people who'd treated him like family. The hardest lesson of this crisis wouldn't be about business management, it would be about the cost of blind trust. I turned to a fresh page in my notebook and began sketching what would become our salvation. An 18-hour crisis management flowchart that would either save Thompson Digital Solutions or confirm its death sentence. Gather around, I said, my voice taking on the authoritative tone I'd used when briefing missions in Kandahar. This is our operation timeline. Every task has a specific window, and failure at any point means total mission failure. I drew a horizontal timeline across the page, marking critical checkpoints: hour 0 to 6, emergency supplier identification and contact; hour 6 to 12, contract negotiation and logistics coordination; hour 12 to 18, production, quality control and delivery. David leaned over the diagram. 18 hours to manufacture and deliver 20,000 units. Marcus, that's impossible. It's improbable, I corrected, but not impossible. I've coordinated faster turnarounds under enemy fire. I pointed to the first section of the timeline. The key is parallel processing instead of sequential operations. While I'm securing emergency suppliers, Amanda handles legal strategy to buy us time with the client. David coordinates with current employees to assess what equipment and materials we can salvage. Amanda studied the flowchart with growing understanding. You want to minimize the lawsuit exposure while simultaneously solving the supply problem. Exactly. Military operations require contingency planning at every level. I began filling in specific tasks under each time block. If supplier A falls through, we immediately pivot to supplier B. If legal strategy 1 fails, we implement strategy 2. No single point of failure. I pulled out my phone and began scrolling through my contact list. Names accumulated over 15 years of military service and 5 years of business consulting. This is why networks matter more than individual relationships. I don't just know one supplier, I know 12. I don't just have one logistics contact, I have a dozen. David watched me work with something approaching awe. How do you keep track of all these connections? Systematic relationship management, I replied, showing him the contact database on my phone. Every person is categorized by expertise, reliability rating, last contact date, and mutual obligations. When I help someone, I note it. When they help me, I note that too. Relationships become strategic assets instead of emotional dependencies. Began assigning specific responsibilities. Amanda, you're calling the client in exactly 30 minutes. Don't apologize that admits liability. Instead, explain that we've identified a supplier quality issue and are implementing emergency replacement protocols. Give them a precise timeline, Replacement shipment delivered by tomorrow evening. What if they refuse to wait? She asked. Then, we are bankrupt anyway, so we lose nothing by trying. I turned to David. You're conducting inventory of all usable materials and coordinating with our production team. I need to know exactly what we can manufacture in-house versus what requires outside suppliers. I tore the flowchart page from my notebook and taped it to the whiteboard. This timeline is sacred. Every decision gets evaluated against these checkpoints. If something threatens the timeline, we eliminate it immediately. David stared at the detailed plan with newfound respect. This is incredibly detailed for something you created in 20 minutes. Crisis management is my specialty, I replied. But David, this only works if you both follow the plan exactly. No creative improvisation, no better ideas, no emotional decisions, military precision, or we fail. Amanda nodded slowly. What about Jake? Do we tell him what we've discovered? Jake Morrison is a problem for Hour 19, I said firmly. Right now, he's irrelevant to mission success. We save the company first, then we deal with the person who tried to destroy it. I looked at both of them, seeing the mixture of hope and terror in their eyes. Are you ready to trust my outdated military thinking for the next 18 hours? At 11:47 p.m., while Amanda and David had gone home to grab a few hours of sleep, I sat alone in the conference room with my military contact list spread across the table like battle plans. The office building was eerily quiet, but my mind was operating at full tactical capacity. The first call went to Staff Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez, now running a precision electronics company in Austin. Marcus Thompson, I said when he answered. On the second ring, I need a favor, and I need it fast. Jesus, Marcus, it's almost midnight. This better be life or death. Close enough. I need 20,000 custom interface units manufactured and delivered to Atlanta within 18 hours. Standard military specifications, but civilian applications. There was a pause. Then Miguel's voice shifted to the professional tone I remembered from our deployment days. Send me the specs. If it's within our capability, we'll make it happen. You saved my ass in Kandahar. Least I can do is return the favor. I emailed him the technical specifications while simultaneously texting Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, who'd transitioned from military logistics to civilian supply chain management. Her company specialized in emergency manufacturing coordination across multiple facilities. The phone rang within minutes. Marcus, I got your message. This timeline is insane, even by military standards. I know. Can you coordinate parallel production across multiple facilities? 20,000 units split between 3 or 4 manufacturers. Possible, but expensive. You're looking at premium rates for emergency production. I glanced at the financial statements Amanda had shown me earlier. Even with premium rates, the cost would be less than what Jake Morrison had been stealing monthly. Cost is secondary to timeline. Can you guarantee delivery? If the specs are accurate and payment is confirmed, within 2 hours, yes. But Marcus, this is calling in every favor I have. I won't be able to help you again anytime soon. Understood? Send me the contracts. The next 4 hours blurred together in a symphony of coordinated chaos. Sergeant First Class Tony Bellucci's company in Phoenix could handle component assembly. Captain Jessica Morrison's firm in Denver specialized in quality control systems that could work in real time. Master Sergeant David Kim had transitioned to logistics coordination and could manage the delivery network. Each conversation followed the same pattern: initial shock at the timeline, followed by the kind of can-do attitude that made military logistics possible. These weren't business relationships built on profit margins and quarterly reports. They were bonds forged in situations where failure meant people died by 3 a.m. I had confirmed production commitments from 4 different facilities, quality control oversight from 2 independent firms, and a delivery network that would coordinate like a precision military operation. The total cost was 40% higher than normal manufacturing, but still 30% less than what Jake Morrison had been charging for inferior products. The real magic happened in the coordination. Sarah Chen's company became the operational hub, receiving components from Phoenix, coordinating assembly in Austin, managing quality control in Denver, and orchestrating delivery from Atlanta. Instead of one vulnerable supply chain, we now had a resilient network that could adapt to problems in real time. At 4:15 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Miguel. First batch coming off production line. Quality looks good. Your family company makes solid products when they're not being sabotaged. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the familiar satisfaction of a complex operation coming together. But this was different from military missions. This wasn't about completing orders or achieving tactical objectives. This was about saving something my family had built, something that represented their dreams and their parents' legacy. David arrived at 5:30 a.m. with coffee and donuts, looking like he'd barely slept. Any updates? I showed him the production tracking screen on my laptop. Facility 1, 60% complete. Facility 2, 40% complete. Quality control systems active at both locations. Delivery trucks staged for immediate transport. Upon completion, he stared at the screen in amazement. This is really happening. It's happening because people keep their word, I replied. Every person I called tonight honored commitments made years ago. That's the difference between building relationships and collecting business cards. The sunrise through the conference room windows felt symbolic as I printed out the signed emergency supply agreement that would save Thompson Digital Solutions. At 6:03 a.m., exactly 18 hours and 16 minutes after David's desperate phone call, we had not just averted disaster, we had exceeded expectations. Amanda arrived at 6:15 a.m., looking anxious but hopeful. Please tell me you have good news. I handed her the delivery confirmation from our lead carrier, 20,000 units, manufactured to specifications, quality controlled at every stage, and currently en route to your client's facility. Delivery confirmed for 2 p.m. today, 6 hours ahead of the deadline you negotiated. She sank into a chair, staring at the paperwork as if it might disappear. This is real. We actually pulled this off. We exceeded the client's specifications, I continued, pulling up the quality control reports on my laptop. Independent testing shows 99.7% functionality higher than their original requirements. They're not just getting replacement products. They're getting an upgrade. David walked in carrying 3 cups of coffee from the lobby cafe, his face still showing the exhaustion of the past 24 hours, but with something new, genuine respect. Marcus, I owe you an apology, a massive apology. You don't owe me anything, I replied, but you do owe it to your employees and your parents' memory to never let something like this happen again. Amanda was scrolling through the production reports, shaking her head in amazement. For different facilities, coordinated perfectly, completed ahead of schedule. How is this even possible? Military logistics networks, I explained. When people's lives depend on reliability, you build relationships differently. Everyone I called last night has been in situations where failure wasn't just disappointing, it was deadly. That creates a different level of commitment. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Chen. Client received advance shipment notification. They're impressed with the turnaround time and want to schedule a meeting about expanding their contract. I showed the message to Amanda and David. Their expressions shifted from relief to something approaching disbelief. They want to expand? Amanda asked. After we completely failed them. You didn't fail them, I corrected. You identified a problem and implemented a solution faster than they thought possible. From their perspective, you've just demonstrated crisis management capabilities that most companies don't possess. David sat down heavily, running his hands through his hair. 24 hours ago, I thought we were finished. Now, our biggest client wants to give us more business. This is what competent crisis management looks like, I said. But David, Amanda, understand something. This was a one-time miracle. The network I activated last night won't be available for routine operations. Going forward, you need to build your own reliable supplier relationships and implement proper quality controls. I pulled out a folder I'd prepared during the overnight hours. These are recommendations for restructuring your supply chain, implementing quality control protocols, and establishing proper vendor oversight. It's based on military logistics principles, adapted for civilian business. Amanda opened the folder and began reading. This is incredibly detailed. When did you have time to write all this? Between phone calls and production updates, I replied. Crisis management isn't just about solving immediate problems, it's about preventing future crises. The conference room fell quiet, except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of employees arriving for the day. For the first time in years, my siblings were looking at me not as their inflexible older brother, but as someone whose experience and methods had quite literally saved their company. Marcus, David said quietly, I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. For 3 years, we've been dismissing your advice, making jokes about military rigidity, basically treating you like you didn't understand modern business. Were you just waiting for us to fail so you could prove you were right? I considered the question carefully. No, I was hoping you would succeed, so I'd never have to prove I was right. Jake Morrison arrived at the office at 9:30 a.m., his usual confident swagger intact, carrying coffee and wearing the kind of smile that had charmed my brother for 15 years. He had no idea that his world was about to collapse. David, Amanda, he called out cheerfully as he entered the conference room. I heard about the client crisis. Don't worry, I've been working my contacts all night. I think I can get us an extension, and maybe negotiate some damage control. He stopped mid-sentence when he saw me sitting at the head of the conference table, surrounded by financial documents, supplier contracts, and a resignation letter I'd prepared for him to sign. Marcus, he said, his smile faltering slightly. I didn't know you were involved in this. Sit down, Jake, I said quietly. We need to talk. David and Amanda flanked the table on either side, their faces grim. The dynamic in the room had shifted completely from 24 hours earlier. Instead of panic and chaos, there was now cold, methodical purpose. Jake sat down slowly, his eyes darting between the documents on the table. Look, if this is about the supplier issues, I can explain. You can start by explaining this, I said, sliding one of the modified contracts across the table. Original supplier, quote, $47 per unit. Your negotiated price, $73 per unit. That's a 55% markup you've been pocketing for 18 months. The color drained from Jake's face, but he rallied quickly. There were additional services, quality guarantees, expedited shipping, Jake. Amanda interrupted, her voice ice cold. Stop lying. We've reviewed every contract, every invoice, every quality report. You've been systematically stealing from us while pretending to be our friend. I pulled out my laptop and showed him the forensic accounting I'd completed during the night. $340,000 in inflated supplier costs, $48,000 in fabricated quality control reports, $62,000 in consulting fees for services never rendered. Should I continue? Jake's confident demeanor cracked completely. His hands trembled as he reached for the contract, scanning it with the desperate hope of finding some explanation that would save him. But the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. I can pay it back, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The markup was just temporary cash flow management. I was going to adjust the pricing once the company stabilized. Bullshit, David said, his voice hard in a way I'd never heard before. Jake, you've been robbing my family. You've been stealing from our parents' legacy while my kids called you Uncle Jake. The resignation letter I'd prepared was comprehensive but merciful. It terminated his consulting relationship immediately, demanded full restitution within 90 days, and included a non-disclosure agreement that would prevent him from discussing company business. In exchange, we wouldn't pursue criminal charges. You have two choices, I explained calmly. Sign this resignation and restitution agreement, or we file criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud. Given the amounts involved and the duration of the theft, you're looking at federal charges and significant prison time. Jake stared at the letter, his earlier charm replaced by the hollow look of someone whose carefully constructed deception had finally collapsed. My kids, my wife, they don't know anything about this. Then you should have thought about them before you decided to steal from people who trusted you, Amanda said coldly. The silence stretched for several minutes while Jake read through the resignation letter. His hands shook as he turned each page, seeing the full scope of his exposure laid out in legal language. If I sign this, he said finally, how do I explain the career change to my family? That's not our problem, I replied. But I'd suggest starting with the truth. Your family deserves to know who they're really married to and living with. Jake picked up the pen with trembling fingers. You know, David, I really did consider you my best friend. David's voice was steady but filled with quiet rage. Best friends don't steal their friends' inheritance, Jake. They don't fabricate reports that could have destroyed everything my parents built. They don't exploit trust to commit crimes. Jake Morrison signed the resignation letter at 10:47 a.m., officially ending his relationship with Thompson Digital Solutions, and beginning what would undoubtedly be the most difficult conversation of his marriage. As he left the building for the last time, he carried with him not just the weight of his crimes, but the knowledge that his betrayal had ultimately made the company stronger by forcing them to confront their own weaknesses. 3 days after Jake Morrison's resignation, I stood before the entire Thompson Digital Solutions staff in the main conference room, presenting what would either transform the company or reveal that it was beyond saving. The new organizational chart I'd developed covered an entire wall, color-coded and detailed enough to guide a military operation. This isn't just about replacing Jake Morrison, I explained to the assembled employees. This is about building systems that prevent any single person from having the power to compromise the entire operation. The chart showed a complete restructuring based on military principles of redundancy and accountability. Instead of one person controlling supplier relationships, we now had 3 independent teams: procurement, quality assurance, and vendor relations. Each team reported 2 different managers, and no major decisions could be made without consensus from at least 2 teams. Sarah Kim, the production manager, raised her hand. This seems like a lot of bureaucracy. Won't it slow down decision-making? Initially, yes, I admitted, but consider the alternative. Jake Morrison's efficient system nearly bankrupted the company in 18 months. Sometimes, slowing down prevents catastrophic failures. I moved to the second section of the chart, which outlined new accountability measures. Every supplier contract requires dual approval. Every quality control report must be verified by an independent inspector. Every financial decision over $5,000 needs documentation and approval from 2 separate departments. David, who had been studying the chart intently, spoke up. Marcus, this level of oversight, it feels like you don't trust any of us. It's not about trust, I replied. It's about creating systems that make corruption difficult and mistakes visible. In military operations, we assume that people will make errors, equipment will fail, and communications will break down. We build redundancy to handle those inevitable failures. Amanda was examining the financial oversight section. These reporting requirements are extensive. Won't this require additional staff? Actually, no. I pointed to a section I'd highlighted in green. By eliminating the inefficiencies Jake Morrison built into your system, we're actually reducing overall labor costs while increasing oversight. The money you were losing to inflated supplier costs will more than cover the administrative expenses. I pulled out a thick binder containing detailed job descriptions, reporting structures, and accountability measures. Every position now has clearly defined responsibilities and measurable performance metrics. No more promotions based on personal relationships. No more critical decisions made by single individuals. Tom Bradley, the senior developer, looked skeptical. This sounds very ... military. Are we running a tech company or a base camp? We're running a business that needs to survive and thrive, I responded. Military organizations excel at coordinating complex operations with multiple moving parts while maintaining strict quality control. Those principles apply whether you're managing supply chains in Afghanistan or manufacturing interfaces in Atlanta. The resistance was palpable, but I'd expected it. Change always provoked anxiety, especially when that change involved accountability measures that many employees had never experienced. Let me be clear about something, I continued, my voice taking on the authoritative tone that had commanded respect in combat situations. This company came within 48 hours of bankruptcy because of poor systems and absent oversight. Everyone in this room almost lost their jobs because we trusted instead of verifying. I gestured to the organizational chart. These changes aren't suggestions, they're requirements for continued employment. If you're uncomfortable with accountability and systematic processes, this might not be the right company for you anymore. The room fell silent. Some employees nodded with understanding, recognizing that the new structure offered job security they'd never had under Jake Morrison's chaotic management. Others looked uncertain, clearly uncomfortable with the level of structure and oversight I was proposing. Amanda stepped forward to address the group. I know this seems overwhelming, but Marcus saved our company. These changes give us the foundation to grow without the constant fear of crisis. As the meeting concluded and employees filed out, I felt the familiar satisfaction of implementing systematic solutions to complex problems. But I also recognized that the real test would come in the following weeks, as people either adapted to the new culture or revealed themselves as incompatible with competent management. The performance metrics report I'd compiled made for sobering reading. Spread across the conference table were 3 years of data that told the story of Thompson Digital Solutions' slow decline under David and Amanda's leadership, a decline that had been masked by Jake Morrison's theft, but would have occurred anyway. These numbers don't lie, I said, pointing to the revenue trends graph. Even without Jake's embezzlement, your company was failing. Client retention down 30%. Employee productivity declining quarterly. Profit margins shrinking every month. David stared at the charts with the expression of someone seeing their reflection clearly for the first time. But we were innovating, adapting to market changes. You were reacting to symptoms instead of addressing root causes, I interrupted. Innovation without implementation is just expensive brainstorming. Adaptation without strategy is just chaos. With good intentions, I pulled out the employee satisfaction surveys I'd conducted over the past week. Your staff has been trying to tell you about these problems for months. Low morale, unclear expectations, inconsistent decision-making, favoritism in promotions. Jake Morrison didn't create these problems, he exploited them. Amanda picked up the survey results, her face growing more troubled with each page. 70% of employees report unclear job expectations. 60% say they don't trust management decisions. Marcus, why didn't they tell us directly? Because you didn't create an environment where honest feedback was safe, I replied. Every employee I interviewed mentioned the same pattern. When people raised concerns, you either dismissed them as negativity or promise to look into it without taking action. I opened my laptop and showed them the exit interview summaries from the past 2 years. Sarah Mitchell, your former operations manager, the one David replaced with Jake's roommate, left because she was tired of being overruled by people with less experience. Michael Chen, your senior developer, quit because his recommendations for quality control were repeatedly ignored. Jennifer Walsh, your best salesperson, left because she couldn't explain to clients why deliveries were consistently late. The pattern was clear and devastating. Every competent employee who had tried to address systemic problems had been marginalized, ignored, or driven away. The company had retained only those willing to accept dysfunction or those lacking the skills to recognize it. This is what happens when you prioritize loyalty over competence, I continued. You create an echo chamber where problems are invisible until they become catastrophic. David's voice was barely audible. We thought we were building a family-friendly workplace culture. You were building a dysfunction-friendly culture, I corrected. There's a difference between treating employees well and avoiding difficult conversations about performance and accountability. I pulled out the most damaging document, a financial projection showing what the company's trajectory would have been without any intervention. Even if Jake Morrison had never stolen a penny, you would have been bankrupt within 18 months. His theft accelerated the timeline, but it didn't create the underlying problems. Amanda was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications. So everything we thought we knew about running a business, was wrong, I finished. But that's not a character flaw, it's a knowledge gap. You inherited a successful company and assumed that maintaining success required the same skills as building it. That's not true. I softened my tone, recognizing that what they were experiencing was essentially professional grief or death of their self-image as competent leaders. Your parents built this company through systematic effort, careful planning, and disciplined execution. You tried to maintain it through good intentions and personal relationships. David looked up at me with an expression I recognized from combat situations. The moment when someone realizes their survival depends on abandoning strategies that feel comfortable but don't work. What do we do now? Now you learn, I said. Simply, you acknowledge that running a business is a skill set that requires study, practice, and constant improvement. You accept that making hard decisions is more important than being liked. You understand that competence and accountability aren't rigid military concepts. They're basic requirements for any organization that wants to survive. The silence in the room was profound. For the first time since I'd known them, my siblings were confronting the reality that their approach to business leadership had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. Marcus, Amanda said finally, will you teach us? I opened my military leadership manual, the same worn copy that had guided me through 3 deployments and countless crisis situations, and placed it on the conference table between David and Amanda. The leather cover was scarred with use, and the pages were filled with annotations from years of practical application. Leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room, I began, reading from a passage I'd highlighted during my first tour in Afghanistan. It's about creating systems that allow smart people to do their best work, while preventing individual failures from compromising the mission. Amanda leaned forward, studying the manual with genuine interest. These are the principles you used during the crisis. These are the principles that kept people alive in situations where failure meant death, I replied. Business leadership faces similar challenges: complex operations, limited resources, unpredictable conditions, and the need for rapid decision-making under pressure. I turned to a chapter titled Command Responsibility and read aloud, a leader's primary obligation is to their people and their mission, not to their own comfort or popularity. Making hard decisions is not optional, it's the core requirement of the job. David winced. That's where we went wrong, isn't it? We wanted everyone to like us instead of respect us. Respect and affection aren't mutually exclusive, I explained. But when you have to choose between them, respect is what keeps organizations functional. Your employees don't need you to be their friend, they need you to be competent, fair, and reliable. I pulled out a notepad and began sketching the leadership framework that had served me well in military and civilian contexts. Leadership has, for pillars, vision, systems, people, and accountability. Every decision you make should strengthen at least one of these pillars, without undermining the others. Vision means understanding where you want the organization to go, and communicating that direction clearly to everyone involved. Your parents had vision, they saw the potential for custom electronics, manufacturing, and built toward that goal systematically. Amanda was taking notes, her business school training finally connecting with practical application. We never articulated a clear vision beyond grow the business. Exactly, grow the business isn't vision, it's wishful thinking. I moved to the second pillar. Systems means creating processes that work regardless of who's implementing them. Good systems make success likely and failure visible. I showed them a page from the manual that outlined standard operating procedures. In military operations, we assume that people will make mistakes, equipment will malfunction, and communication will break down. We build redundancy and checkpoints to handle those inevitable problems. Jake Morrison was able to steal from you because you had no systems to prevent or detect theft. You trusted instead of verifying, and you created single points of failure throughout your operation. David was studying the manual intently. What about the people pillar? People means hiring for competence, training for improvement, and removing those who can't or won't perform at required standards. I turned to a section about personnel management. In combat, incompetent people get other people killed. In business, incompetent people get other people fired when the company fails. I looked directly at both of them. You hired and promoted based on personal relationships instead of demonstrated ability. That's not kindness, it's negligence that put everyone's livelihood at risk. The fourth pillar was the most challenging for them to accept. Accountability means measuring performance against clear standards and implementing consequences both positive and negative based on results. Amanda shifted uncomfortably. That sounds harsh. What's harsh is letting poor performance continue until it destroys the entire organization, I replied. Accountability protects good employees from the consequences of bad employees' failures. Closed the manual and looked at both of them seriously. Here's what you need to understand. Leadership isn't about controlling people. It's about creating conditions where people can succeed. But that requires making decisions based on what's effective, rather than what feels good. David was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications. How long did it take you to learn this? I'm still learning, I admitted. But the basic framework, about 2 years of practical application under experienced mentors who cared more about developing my competence than protecting my feelings. I reopened the manual to a page I'd bookmarked years earlier. The most important lesson in here isn't about tactics or strategy, it's about personal responsibility. As a leader, every failure in your organization is ultimately your failure. Not because you personally made every mistake, but because you created the conditions that allowed those mistakes to occur. The weight of that responsibility was visible on their faces. For years, they'd been playing at leadership without understanding what it actually required. Marcus, Amanda said quietly, will you stay and help us implement this properly? I looked at my siblings, really looked at them and saw something I hadn't seen in years. Genuine humility and a willingness to learn from their mistakes. Yes, I said, but understand that this won't be comfortable. Real leadership development requires confronting uncomfortable truths about yourself and making changes that feel unnatural at first. For the first time since returning from deployment, I felt like my military experience was being valued rather than dismissed and, more importantly, I felt like I was helping to build something lasting. The training schedule I'd developed for David and Amanda looked like a military curriculum adapted for civilian leadership development. Posted on the conference room wall, it outlined a 12-week program that would systematically rebuild their understanding of business management from the ground up. Every Tuesday at 7 a.m., we conduct operational briefings, I explained, pointing to the schedule. Every employee reports on their previous week's objectives, current week's goals, and any obstacles requiring management intervention. No exceptions, no excuses. David studied the schedule with a mixture of appreciation and apprehension. 7 a.m. seems early for creative professionals. 7 a.m. is when serious business gets conducted, I replied. The military doesn't operate on creative professional time, we operate on mission-critical time. Your employees will adapt, and those who don't probably aren't committed enough to help rebuild this company. I moved to the second section of the training program. Thursday afternoons are dedicated to systems review. We examine one operational process each week, identify inefficiencies or vulnerabilities, and implement improvements. This week, we're starting with supplier management. Amanda was already making notes in her calendar. How do we know if these changes are working? Metrics, I said, showing them the dashboard I'd created for tracking key performance indicators. Employee productivity, client satisfaction, financial performance, quality control, statistics. We measure everything, and we review the measurements. Weekly, I pulled out a thick binder containing case studies from my consulting work. Each week, you'll also study one business crisis and analyze how proper systems and leadership could have prevented or mitigated the problem. This isn't theoretical. These are real companies that failed because their leaders made predictable mistakes. The first case study involved a manufacturing company that had collapsed due to supplier fraud, nearly identical to their situation with Jake Morrison. Notice the pattern, I said, highlighting key passages. Single points of failure, absent, oversight, decisions based on personal relationships rather than performance metrics. David was reading with obvious discomfort. This is basically our story. This is everyone's story who makes the same fundamental errors, I replied. The difference is that you're getting a second chance to learn from these mistakes instead of being destroyed by them. I opened to the next section of the training schedule. Friday morning leadership exercises involve role-playing difficult scenarios, having uncomfortable conversations with underperforming employees, delivering bad news to clients, making decisions that will be unpopular but necessary. Amanda looked skeptical. Role-playing seems artificial. Combat training involves extensive role-playing because artificial practice makes real situations manageable, I explained. You're going to practice firing people, confronting poor performance, and defending unpopular decisions until you can do it competently when the stakes are real. The final component of the training was the most challenging. Saturday morning strategic planning sessions. You'll learn to think beyond immediate problems and develop long-term objectives with actionable implementation plans. I showed them a strategic planning template I'd adapted from military mission planning. Every strategic goal must include specific metrics, timeline constraints, resource requirements, and contingency plans. No more vague aspirations about growing the business or improving company culture. David was studying the template intently. This level of detail, it's intimidating. It's comprehensive, I corrected, and comprehensiveness is what separates successful operations from wishful thinking. I sat down across from them, my tone becoming more personal. Look, I know this seems overwhelming, but consider the alternative. 3 weeks ago, you were 48 hours from bankruptcy. You can either learn to manage your company competently, or you can lose everything your parents built. Amanda nodded slowly. What if we struggle with some of these concepts? Then we practice until you don't struggle, I said simply. Military training doesn't stop when someone finds something difficult. intensifies until competence is achieved. I pulled out the first week's reading assignments, 3 books on business leadership, 2 case studies of successful crisis management, and 1 detailed analysis of supply chain security. This is homework, real homework, with deadlines and accountability. David looked at the reading list and laughed with amusement, but with the recognition of someone seeing the scope of their ignorance clearly for the first time. I haven't had homework since business school. Business school taught you theory, I replied. This is teaching you practice. The difference between knowing how something should work and being able to make it work when everything is going wrong. I stood up and gathered my materials. The training starts Monday morning. Show up prepared, or don't show up at all. I'm not interested in teaching people who aren't committed to learning. As I walked toward the door, Amanda called after me. Marcus, thank you. Not just for saving the company, but for caring enough to teach us how to deserve it. For the first time in years, I felt like the older brother I'd always wanted to be, not just the critic pointing out their failures, but the mentor helping them build something better. 6 weeks into the leadership transformation program, the updated company mission statement hung prominently in the main lobby, a document that embodied everything Thompson Digital Solutions had learned about the difference between good intentions and effective action, excellence through accountability, innovation through discipline, growth through competence. Amanda read aloud during our Tuesday morning operational briefing. It's completely different from our old mission statement. The old mission statement was marketing copy, I replied, reviewing the weekly performance metrics on my laptop. This one is operational guidance. Every decision gets evaluated against these principles. The change in company culture was measurable and dramatic. Employee productivity had increased 37% since implementing systematic management practices. Client satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs. Most importantly, financial performance had stabilized and begun growing for the first time in 18 months. David stood at the front of the conference room, conducting the weekly briefing with a confidence I'd never seen from him before. Production team reports 100% on-time delivery for the 4th consecutive week. Quality control shows 0 defects in final products. Client services handled 43 inquiries with an average resolution time of 18 hours. The employees around the table responded with visible pride. Sarah Kim, the production manager who had initially resisted the new systems, was now one of their strongest advocates. The new quality control protocols catch problems before they reach clients. It's actually less stressful knowing that everything gets checked twice. Tom Bradley, the senior developer who had questioned the military approach, was reviewing his team's performance metrics. Code review requirements have improved our output quality significantly. We're catching bugs in development instead of after deployment. I watched this transformation with the satisfaction of someone seeing systematic training produce measurable results. But the real change wasn't in the metrics, it was in the attitudes and behaviors that created those metrics. Amanda, report. On client relations, David continued, maintaining the structured format we'd established. 3 new contracts signed this month, including 1 expansion from our crisis client, Amanda reported. Client feedback consistently mentions our reliability and systematic approach to problem solving. They trust us to deliver what we promise when we promise it. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. The rigid military thinking that David and Amanda had mocked for years was now the foundation of their business success. Structure hadn't stifled creativity, had created conditions where creativity could be channeled productively. After the meeting, I gathered the updated mission statement documents to review the implementation progress. The transformation went beyond business metrics to fundamental changes in how people approached their work. Marcus, Sarah Kim approached me after the other employees had left. I wanted to thank you for the new systems. I've been here 3 years, And this is the first time I've felt like my work really matters to the company's success. Your work always mattered, I replied. The difference is that now there are systems in place to recognize and reward competence instead of overlooking it. I pulled out the employee satisfaction surveys from the previous week. The results told a story of organizational healing that went far beyond financial recovery. 92% of employees reported clear understanding of their job expectations. 88% felt confident that good performance would be recognized and rewarded. Most significantly, employee retention had stabilized completely. The exodus of competent workers that had characterized Jake Morrison's tenure had stopped. People were choosing to stay because they finally worked for an organization that valued their contributions. The mission statement wasn't just words on a wallet, was the foundation of a culture that attracted and retained people who took pride in excellent work. Excellence through accountability meant that standards were clear and consistently applied. Innovation through discipline meant that creativity was channeled toward productive outcomes. Growth through competence meant that advancement was based on demonstrated ability rather than personal relationships. David and Amanda had learned that building a strong company culture wasn't about making everyone happy, was about creating conditions where capable people could do their best work while maintaining high standards for performance and behavior. The transformation was complete, but more importantly, it was sustainable because it was based on systems rather than personalities. The employee feedback forms scattered across my desk told a story I hadn't anticipated when I first implemented systematic management practices at Thompson Digital Solutions, rather than the grudging compliance I'd expected. The responses showed genuine enthusiasm for the new operational structure. The accountability systems make me feel more secure about my job, wrote Jennifer Martinez from accounting. I know exactly what's expected of me, and I know that my good work gets noticed and rewarded. Tom Bradley, who had been the most vocal critic of the military approach, had submitted the longest feedback form. I initially thought the new systems would stifle creativity, but the opposite happened. Clear expectations and systematic support actually freed me to focus on innovation instead of constantly worrying about unclear priorities. I was reviewing these responses when Amanda knocked on the conference room door. "Marcus, do you have a minute? There's something you need to see." She led me to the production floor, where a group of employees had gathered around Sarah Kim's workstation. Instead of the chaotic multitasking that had characterized their previous work style, everyone was focused on specific tasks with obvious purpose and coordination. "Watch this," Amanda said quietly. Sarah Kim was training to new employees using the systematic protocols we'd implemented. But more than just following procedures, she was explaining the reasoning behind each step, helping them understand how their individual work contributed to overall quality and efficiency. "The quality control checkpoints aren't bureaucracy," Sarah was explaining. "They're protection for your reputation and job security. When we catch problems early, we don't have to explain failures to clients or worry about losing contracts." One of the new employees, a recent engineering graduate named Michael Chen, was taking detailed notes. "So the systematic approach actually prevents the kind of crisis that almost destroyed the company." "Exactly," Sarah replied. "Before these systems, we were always reactive, putting out fires and scrambling to fix problems. Now we're proactive, preventing problems before they happen." I felt a surge of professional pride watching this interaction. Sarah hadn't just adapted to the new systems, she had internalized the principles and was teaching them to others. The transformation was becoming self-sustaining. Amanda and I returned to the conference room, where she showed me a stack of similar feedback forms. "Marcus, 94% of employees rate the new management structure as significantly better than the previous approach. People are actually thanking us for implementing accountability measures." I read through more responses, each one revealing how systematic management had improved both job satisfaction and performance. Before, I never knew if I was doing good work because feedback was random and inconsistent. Wrote Maria Santos from customer service. Now I get regular, specific feedback that helps me improve continuously. The most surprising feedback came from employees who had initially seemed most resistant to change. I thought military-style management would be oppressive, wrote David Kim from technical support. Instead, it's liberating. I don't have to guess what's expected or worry about arbitrary decisions affecting my career. David entered the conference room carrying coffee and a satisfied expression. Have you seen the productivity reports from this week? He spread the latest metrics across the table. Output per employee had increased 43% since implementing systematic management. Error rates had dropped to near zero. Customer satisfaction scores had reached levels the company had never previously achieved. But look at this, David continued, pointing to employee overtime statistics. People are working fewer hours while producing better results. The efficiency gains from systematic processes have eliminated most of the crisis-driven overtime that used to be routine. I studied the reports with growing amazement. The transformation exceeded my most optimistic projections. This level of improvement suggests that your previous management approach wasn't just inefficient, it was actively counterproductive. Amanda nodded ruefully. We were creating the problems we thought we were solving. Trying to be flexible actually created chaos. Avoiding rigid systems actually made everything more difficult for employees. The irony was profound, but not uncommon. In my consulting experience, I'd seen many organizations where good intentions produced terrible outcomes, because leadership confused being liked with being effective. The most important lesson here, I said, gathering the feedback forms, is that employees want competent leadership more than they want friendly leadership. People prefer working for managers who set clear expectations and provide consistent support over managers who try to be everyone's friend while avoiding difficult decisions. David was studying the employee satisfaction data with obvious relief. For 3 years, I was terrified of being seen as a demanding boss. It turns out that being a competent boss is what people actually wanted. The evidence was overwhelming. Systematic management hadn't crushed morale. It had liberated people to do their best work without the constant stress of unclear expectations and inconsistent leadership. The thank you card from Meridian Industries arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 months after the crisis that had nearly destroyed Thompson Digital Solutions. I opened it in the conference room while David and Amanda reviewed the latest financial reports that showed the company was not just surviving, but thriving beyond anything they had previously achieved. Dear Thompson Digital Solutions team, I read aloud. We wanted to express our gratitude for your exceptional crisis management and the superior quality of your replacement products. Your rapid response and systematic approach to problem solving convinced us that TDS should be our primary supplier going forward. We're pleased to formalize this relationship with the attached 3-year contract extension. Amanda looked up from her laptop, smiling with a mixture of pride and disbelief. 3 years. That's the longest contract commitment we've ever received. David was studying the contract terms with obvious satisfaction. Not just 3 years there, increasing their order volume by 60% and adding to new product lines. Marcus, this is directly because of the systems you implemented. I set the card on the table and reviewed our latest performance metrics. The numbers told a story of complete organizational transformation that went far beyond crisis recovery. Revenue had increased 47% since implementing systematic management. Profit margins had more than doubled. Employee satisfaction and retention had reached levels that attracted top talent from competitors. But the real victory isn't in these numbers, I said, pointing to the financial reports. It's in the fact that this success is sustainable. You're not dependent on any single person or relationship anymore. The transformation was visible in every aspect of the company's operations. The chaotic environment I'd encountered during the crisis had been replaced by purposeful coordination. Instead of employees working independently with unclear objectives, everyone understood how their role contributed to overall success. We have 3 more companies requesting proposals based on referrals from satisfied clients, Amanda reported. Word is spreading that TDS delivers exactly what we promise, when we promise it. I pulled out my phone and showed them the LinkedIn message I'd received that morning from Miguel Rodriguez, the former staff sergeant who had helped coordinate the emergency production during our crisis. Marcus, whatever you did at Thompson, digital solutions worked. I've got 2 other companies asking if I can replicate the supply chain coordination we used for your family's emergency. Mind if I use you as a reference? The ripple effects of competent management extended beyond the company itself. Our systematic approach to crisis resolution had become a case study that other businesses wanted to emulate. The outdated military, thinking that David and Amanda had once mocked, was now recognized as cutting-edge crisis management. There's something else, David said, pulling out a folder I hadn't seen before. We've been invited to speak at the Atlanta Business Association conference about crisis management and organizational transformation. They want to know how we went from near bankruptcy to industry leadership in 3 months. The irony was delicious. 3 months earlier, David and Amanda had been embarrassed by their business struggles, avoiding industry events where their declining performance might be noticed. Now they were being asked to share their success story with other business leaders. What are you going to tell them? I asked. Amanda answered without hesitation. That systematic management isn't rigid bureaucracy, it's the foundation of sustainable success. That accountability measures don't stifle creativity, they channel it productively. That military principles aren't outdated, they're time-tested solutions to universal leadership challenges. I looked at my siblings and felt a profound sense of completion. The crisis that had nearly destroyed their company had ultimately saved it by forcing them to confront fundamental flaws in their approach to leadership and management. You know what this means, I said, gathering the thank you card and financial reports. You don't need me anymore. You've internalized the principles and made them part of your company culture. David and Amanda exchanged a look that contained 3 months of shared learning and growth. Actually, David said, we were hoping you'd consider making this permanent. Chief Operating Officer, with equity stake and full authority over systematic management implementation. The offer was generous and professionally attractive, but more than that, it represented something I'd never expected. My family's recognition that my experience and methods had value beyond crisis management. We're not asking you to save us anymore, Amanda added. We're asking you to help us build something better than what our parents left us. For the first time since returning from deployment, I felt like my military service had prepared me for something meaningful in civilian life, not just surviving crises, but preventing them through competent leadership and systematic thinking. 6 months after the crisis that changed everything, I stood in the same conference room where I had once been dismissed as too rigid for modern business, watching David conduct a quarterly review meeting with the confidence and competence of someone who had learned to value substance over style. The updated family photo on my desk taken at last month's company celebration showed 3 siblings who had finally learned to respect each other's strengths instead of competing over their differences. David's natural charisma was now channeled through systematic leadership principles. Amanda's analytical intelligence was applied to strategic planning rather than reactive problem-solving. My military experience was valued as practical wisdom rather than dismissed as outdated thinking. Thompson Digital Solutions has exceeded all performance targets for the 2nd consecutive quarter, David announced to the assembled employees. Revenue up 63% year-over-year. Client satisfaction at 97%. Employee retention at 100%. We haven't lost a single person to competitors since implementing systematic management practices. The applause around the conference table was genuine, reflecting the satisfaction of people who took pride in excellent work. But the real victory was subtler, an organizational culture that had been transformed from dysfunction to competence. Through the application of time-tested principles, Amanda presented the strategic planning update with the kind of detailed analysis that would have impressed my military commanders. We've secured contracts through next year and identified expansion opportunities in 3 new markets. Our reputation for reliability and systematic quality control has become our primary competitive advantage. I watched this presentation with the satisfaction of someone who had seen systematic training produce measurable results. But more than professional pride, I felt the deeper satisfaction of family relationships healed through mutual respect and shared purpose. The transformation extended beyond business metrics to personal growth that had surprised all of us. David had discovered that competent leadership was more fulfilling than being universally liked. Amanda had learned that systematic thinking enhanced rather than limited her analytical capabilities. I had found a way to apply military experience that honored both my service and my family's needs. Marcus, David said as the meeting concluded, any final observations about our quarterly performance? I reviewed the performance dashboard one more time, noting metrics that exceeded our most optimistic projections. The numbers are impressive, but the most important achievement is that this success is sustainable. You've built systems that work regardless of market conditions or personnel changes. After the employees filed out, the 3 of us remained in the conference room not as crisis managers or reluctant students, but as partners who had learned to value each other's contributions. You know what's funny? Amanda said, studying the family photo on my desk. For years, we thought your military experience was irrelevant to business. It turns out that business needed exactly what military service taught you. And for years, I thought you were wasting the opportunities our parents created, I replied. It turns out you just needed different tools to succeed. David was reviewing the thank you cards and client testimonials that now filled an entire wall of the conference room. The most important lesson wasn't about business management, it was about family. We stopped competing with each other and started building something together. The crisis that had nearly destroyed Thompson Digital Solutions had ultimately saved it by forcing all of us to confront uncomfortable truths about competence, accountability, and the difference between good intentions and effective action. The company our parents had built was now stronger than they had ever imagined possible, but the real transformation was personal. 3 siblings who had spent years misunderstanding each other had learned to appreciate different forms of intelligence and experience. Military discipline, business intuition, and analytical thinking weren't competing approaches, they were complementary strengths that created something more powerful than any individual contribution. So what's next? Amanda asked. I looked at the strategic planning documents spread across the table, the employee satisfaction surveys, the client contracts, and the family photo that captured our journey from crisis to collaboration. Next, we build something that makes our parents proud and ensures that their legacy continues to grow, I said. Together, the afternoon sunlight streaming through the conference room windows illuminated not just business documents, but the evidence of a family that had learned to transform crisis into opportunity, misunderstanding into respect, and individual strengths into collective success. For the first time since returning from deployment, I knew exactly where I belonged and what I was meant to contribute. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not on foreign soil, but in conference rooms, where the stakes are measured in relationships healed and potential fulfilled.